Donald Trump's sudden and aggressive shift in rhetoric against Russia is not a random turn of phrase. It is the direct, unvarnished consequence of a public, personal humiliation that a man of his ego could not possibly ignore. The laughter of a dictator, it turns out, is the last thing you want to hear when you're counting on his support. For months, the Kremlin built its entire strategy on a massive and fatal miscalculation. They believed they had Trump figured out. They saw him as a predictable ally, a man who, driven by his isolationist instincts, would abandon Ukraine and dismantle NATO. The Kremlin's propaganda machine, along with its echo chamber of Z-bloggers and state media, spent months constructing a fantasy narrative around a friend Donnie, a man who would be their savior. They were so confident in this illusion that they made no alternative plans. They made a crucial mistake. They confused Trump's pre-election rhetoric with a firm, predictable commitment. But the reality of their relationship has proven to be a dangerous game of chance. Trump, as we've seen, is not an ally in the traditional sense. He is an ally of his own ego, a man who operates on a transactional basis where personal respect and a sense of dominance are more important than any geopolitical strategy. And in his hubris, the Kremlin made a crucial mistake. They publicly disrespected him. In a series of moves that would have been unthinkable for a traditional diplomat, the Kremlin, through its various mouthpieces, publicly dismissed Trump's offers of negotiation and insisted it would not meet with him. They mocked his attempts at peacemaking and treated his public pronouncements as irrelevant. This was not just a political snub. It was a public slap in the face to a man who believes he is the world's ultimate dealmaker. For a man like Trump, who has spent his entire career cultivating an image of a strong, decisive, and respected leader, this was the ultimate insult. The result was a seismic shift in rhetoric. A man who was once speaking about ending the war in 24 hours is now calling the Russian army a paper tiger and its economy a shithole. This wasn't a new, well-thought-out policy change. It was an impulsive, personal response. Trump is a man who does not like to be seen as weak, as a man who has been played. His new aggressive rhetoric is a way for him to re-establish his dominance and save face in front of his audience. He is telling the world, and most importantly the Kremlin, that he is not a man to be trifled with. This is a catastrophic development for Russia. The Kremlin had a plan for a predictable, pro-Russian Trump. It had no plan for a man who would turn on them simply because of a bruised ego. In its hubris, the Kremlin thought it could control him, but it has now created a new and dangerous enemy who is acting not out of a coherent strategy, but out of a personal vendetta. The laughter of a dictator, it turns out, is the last thing you want to hear when you're counting on his support.
We've discussed the clash of egos, but what truly underpins Trump's sudden aggressive rhetoric is a cold, hard dose of reality. His words, which once seemed like the rambling of a political outsider, have now become a brutal and accurate assessment of a military in decline. When he called the Russian army a paper tiger, it was more than just a taunt. It was a public admission that the illusion of Russia's military might has finally crumbled. This is the end of illusions, a moment where even Russia's most loyal cheerleaders are being forced to admit a simple, undeniable truth. The Russian army is stuck in a disastrous stalemate and is on the verge of a complete collapse. The evidence for this is now coming from within Russia itself. While state television continues to spout propaganda about glorious victories, the voices of the Z-bloggers and military experts are telling a different story. They are admitting what we have known for months, that the Russian army has no real military advantage, that its offensive has stalled, and that it is paying a catastrophic price for a war that it cannot win. Trump's words, therefore, are not an invention. They are a direct reflection of the reality on the ground, a reality that the Kremlin has desperately tried to hide. The truth is, the Russian army's offensive has been a brutal, bloody disaster. For months, Russian forces have been stuck in a stalemate on the front lines, paying an immense price in human lives and equipment for almost no territorial gain. They have been unable to achieve any major breakthroughs, and their attempts to capture key cities have been a complete and utter failure. The Russian command, in a desperate attempt to conserve its modern armor, has resorted to a war of attrition, using infantry assaults that are easily contained and defeated by Ukrainian forces. The result is a slow, methodical, and bloody campaign that is accomplishing nothing but the exhaustion of Russia's last remaining resources. The exhaustion of the Russian army is not just a tactical problem, it's a strategic one. The Russian military, which came into this war with vast reserves of Soviet-era equipment, has now exhausted its stockpiles. They are being forced to pull relics from long-term storage, tanks and armored vehicles from the 1950s and 60s that are more a symbol of desperation than of military might. This isn't a military that is winning, it's a military that is scraping the bottom of the barrel, a force that has been completely hollowed out by its own reckless campaign. The Z-bloggers, who once celebrated the Russian military, are now openly complaining about the lack of resources, the outdated equipment, and the massive casualties. This is a sign of a military that is not just failing on the battlefield, but is also losing the support of its own most loyal cheerleaders. The most damning piece of evidence for this collapse is the fact that the Russian army has completely lost its will to fight. The constant and brutal casualties, the lack of modern equipment, and the complete failure to achieve any of its objectives have led to a crisis of morale. The Z-bloggers are now openly discussing the high rates of desertion and the lack of motivation in the Russian army. This isn't a military that is winning, it's a military that is on the verge of a complete and total collapse. And Trump, in his own cynical and brutal way, has simply given voice to this undeniable reality. His words are not a new, unthought-out policy. They are a direct reflection of the truth on the ground. The Russian army is a paper tiger, and the world is finally seeing it for what it is.
We've discussed the military failures of the Russian army, but the collapse of the Russian war machine is not a purely military story. It is a story of economic disaster, a crisis so profound that it is now the real reason for panic in the Kremlin. Trump's brutal words, where he called the Russian economy a shithole, were not just a random insult. They were a direct and unvarnished reflection of a reality that the Kremlin has desperately tried to hide from its own people and from the world. The evidence of this economic collapse is everywhere. The Russian economy, which was once a source of strength for the Kremlin, has now become a liability. The combination of a crippling sanctions regime and Ukraine's relentless drone attacks has created a perfect storm of financial ruin. The most visible sign of this is a nationwide fuel crisis. This is not a localized problem. It is a crisis that is impacting over 20 regions of Russia, with long lines at gas stations, skyrocketing prices, and a crippling lack of supply. This isn't just an inconvenience for civilians, it's a direct threat to the country's logistical chain and a sign that the state is losing its ability to provide for its own people. But the most damning indictment of Russia's economic position comes from its so-called allies. The Kremlin has spent years trying to convince the world that it has overcome international isolation and has found new, powerful partners in China and India. The reality is the opposite. China and India are not allies in the traditional sense. They are opportunistic partners who are taking advantage of Russia's desperation. They are buying Russia's oil and gas at a massive discount, costing the Russian state billions of dollars in revenue. This is a clear sign that Russia has not achieved global standing. It has simply exchanged a place in the global community for a subservient role to a single master. Russia's economy is now a vassal state, a supplier of raw materials to a far more powerful China, which dictates the terms of trade and takes a massive cut of the profits. This is the real reason for panic in the Kremlin. The economic failures are not just financial, they are a direct threat to the regime's stability. For a leader who has built his power on a narrative of strength and stability, the public signs of a failing economy are a direct threat to his rule. The fuel shortages, the empty car factories, the rising prices, these are all a public confession of a state that is failing to provide for its own people. This is the ultimate political risk for a regime that has staked its entire legitimacy on its ability to deliver prosperity and order. The panic is justified. Because the Russian leadership now knows that its financial resources are finite, and the war in its current form is a terminal event. The economic collapse is not just a problem of tactics, it's a terminal diagnosis for a war machine that has been built on a foundation of lies. The Russian leadership believed it could fight a long, protracted war of attrition and outlast the West, but they have found themselves in a no-win situation. The budget deficit is a gaping hole that they cannot fill. The civilian economy is collapsing. Sanctions are choking off export revenues, and a commitment to a military budget they cannot afford. All of these factors are now converging on a single point: the complete and total exhaustion of Russia's financial resources. The war in its current form is no longer sustainable.
We've discussed the psychological game that is being played out, but the most important part of this story is not the rhetoric, it's the consequences. Donald Trump's sudden and aggressive shift in tone is more than just a personal act of defiance. It is a green light for the West to do what it has been afraid to do for months. This is a moment of profound strategic importance, a new road to victory that Russia, in its arrogance, has now opened for its enemies. For months, the Western alliance, and particularly Europe, was frozen by fear and uncertainty. European countries were hesitant to increase their aid to Ukraine, worried that their actions would be seen as provocative and would anger Trump. They were worried that their efforts to help Ukraine would be met with scorn and ridicule from the new American administration. That fear, that uncertainty, was a powerful tool for Russia, a source of paralysis that allowed it to continue its brutal war. But that paralysis is now gone. Trump's new aggressive rhetoric has created a new reality. The man who once called European allies freeloaders is now calling Russia a paper tiger. The fear of being seen as soft on Russia is now gone, replaced by a new urgency to be seen as tough. This is a crucial pivot. Trump's ego has, for the first time in his presidency, been aligned with the strategic interests of the Western alliance. His desire to look strong has given the West the political cover it needs to do what it should have done months ago: increase the pressure on Russia. And the tools to do so are now readily available. Trump's new stance is a green light for a new, more aggressive sanctions regime. He can use his political influence to push for a new wave of sanctions that will target Russia's most vulnerable assets. We've already discussed the possibility of sanctions on Russia's Shadow Fleet, a network of aging tankers that is the lifeblood of its war economy. A targeted sanction against this fleet, which would cripple Russia's ability to sell its oil and gas, is now not just a possibility, it is a probability. The political will to do so has now been created. This new political dynamic has also opened the door for a massive increase in military aid to Ukraine. The fear that Trump would cut off aid or condemn a new wave of weapons transfers is now gone. The US and European countries can now move to sell and transfer a new generation of military hardware to Ukraine without fear of political reprisal. This is a critical development. The war is now entering a new phase, one where Russia's military, already exhausted and depleted, will be facing a new, more powerful, and more technologically advanced Ukrainian army. The new road to victory is paved with the weapons that Russia's arrogance has now unleashed. This is the ultimate paradox of the Trump era. The unpredictability that was once a threat to the West has now become a threat to Russia. The man who was supposed to be a tool for the Kremlin's ambitions has now become its biggest and most dangerous enemy. Trump's shift in rhetoric is not a simple change in policy. It is a strategic turning point that will fundamentally alter the course of the war. It is a moment where the world's most powerful military alliance has been given the green light to do what it needs to do to win. And it is a signal to Russia that its time is running out. This is a new road to victory, and it is a road that Russia, in its arrogance, has now paved for its enemies. We have dissected the motivations, the paradoxes, and the threats that define this new phase of the war. But now we must ask the final and most crucial question: what does it all mean? What is the final verdict on a war that has been defined by Russian hubris and Ukrainian resilience? The conclusion is clear and undeniable.
The war has entered a new phase, a phase in which the final defeat of Russia is not just a possibility, but a historical inevitability. The war will end, but it will end not on Russia's terms, but on Ukraine's. The panic in the Kremlin is justified. The Russian leadership has gambled everything on a prolonged war of attrition, believing that it could outlast a fractured and indecisive West. But the West, ironically, has been united by the very unpredictability of Donald Trump. The man who was supposed to be a tool of the Kremlin's ambitions has instead become its greatest and most dangerous enemy. Trump's sudden and aggressive shift in rhetoric, born out of a personal affront to his ego, has created a new reality. It has given the West the political cover it needs to increase pressure on Russia, to accelerate the sale of weapons to Ukraine, and to tighten the screws of a sanctions regime that is finally beginning to bite. This is a new and unprecedented situation. The war has moved from a battlefield of attrition to a battlefield of politics and economics. The Russian leadership, which has been fighting a war on paper, is now being forced to face the reality of a financial and military collapse. The budget deficit is a gaping hole that they cannot fill. The civilian economy is collapsing, and the sanctions are cutting off the revenue that is the lifeblood of the Russian state. All of these factors are now converging on a single point: the complete and total exhaustion of Russia's financial resources. The war, in its current form, is a terminal event. The final verdict on this war is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of strategic inevitability. The Russian leadership has made a series of catastrophic blunders, and it is now paying the ultimate price. It has lost its most professional military units, its modern equipment, and its geopolitical influence. It has been forced to become a vassal state to China, and it has been humiliated on the world stage by its own tactical incompetence and by the personal whims of a man it thought it could control. The war will end not because Ukraine is winning, but because Russia is losing on a fundamental, systemic level. The war is a collision of egos, and Russia's arrogance and misjudgment have placed it in a position where its future now depends on the unpredictable whims of a man who values his own image above all else. This is a final, damning judgment on a leader who believes he is a master strategist, but is in fact a prisoner of his own fatal flaw. The war is lost, but the tragedy is that the final act is not yet written, and the price of Russia's pride is one that the entire world will have to pay.